talking with Michigan Representative Rashida Tlaib, Detroit Justice Center Executive Amanda Alexander, and Michigan Liberation Campaign Director Nicholas Buckingham about new legislation proposed by Representative Tlaib and joined by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Congresswoman Barbara Lee. This is the Dismantle Mass Incarceration for Public Health Act, and it would require states that receive certain justice-related grants to release juveniles, low-risk adults, and medically vulnerable people from jails and prisons. So protests have continued now for nearly a month in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the litany of Black men and women killed by police in America. This past weekend, Rayshard Brooks was shot in the back twice by police officers. Breonna Taylor, an EMT, was shot 8 times in her sleep by militarized police entering her house forcibly in the middle of the night. Tony McDade, a transgender Black man, was killed by police in Tallahassee, the 3rd police killing of a Black person there since March. So at the same time as people are protesting police violence, Black people are also disproportionately represented in prisons and jails and have been disproportionately killed, therefore, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jails and prisons have become incubators for this pandemic, hotspots of transmission, with many of the worst US hotspots occurring in America's biggest jails. This also impacts surrounding communities. Guards go home, visitors go home, people come in to be educators and nurses, and people complete their time there and return to the community. Most of the 722,000 people in local jails right now are there pre-trial or recently arrested. So this means people who are not guilty, not proven guilty of any crime, not convicted of any crime, people who are only there because they don't have the money to go home. The Dismantle Mass Incarceration for Public Health Act would incentivize states to decriminalize and release many low-risk individuals, including kids, recognizing that the greatest danger to public health is posed by this acceleration of the pandemic in jails, which the ACLU and public health experts predict will add 100,000 additional deaths to the already staggering American death toll. So I'd like to begin by speaking with Representative Tlaib. Your new legislation, this legislation that you're joined by Congresswoman Pressley and Lee on, would incentivize states to decriminalize low-level offenses and release people from custody under certain very specific conditions. So can you tell our audience a little bit about what you want the bill to do and what that would look like in their home community?
Yeah, I don't know about, I know a lot of people use the word decriminalize, but I think it's really important to understand that many, over 700,000 people that are incarcerated right now have not been convicted of a crime. I think that's really important to understand. Close to 1 million people right now are incarcerated that haven't gone through a fair, just judicial process, but also, do not belong there, especially during a pandemic. And I think just like with the issue around poverty, healthcare, around racism in our country, the pandemic really exposed some of these broken systems, including what's happening with mass incarceration in our country. So our bill exposes the fact that our most vulnerable not only includes our seniors, are those that have pre-existing conditions, but also those that are in our care in the incarceration system that really has been overwhelmingly broken, but also aggressive. And has been, in a way, so unjust, where most people that I know, Detroit Justice Center, Michigan Liberation, have been trying to get out are, our mothers who just couldn't afford their cash bail bonds, to a number of people that just haven't been able to get in front of someone to say, look, I don't belong here. This is what happened. Whatever the process is, it's broken. And it should not be a death sentence for them to be incarcerated right now during a pandemic, and we could do better. I know Michigan has really been a leader in some ways in having a much more aggressive release program, but we haven't seen that nationwide. And this really spells out, a number of concerns of those that have, illnesses, those that really don't belong in the system right now, before the pandemic or even during the pandemic, especially now, where we know COVID has killed overwhelmingly more African Americans in our country than anywhere else. And if you look at those that are really been targeted by this mass incarceration, broken system, it has been our Black neighbors across the country. So it is important for us to not only expose what is happening with incarceration in our country, but also the fact that we can't allow people to die in our care when they don't belong there. And so it is very, very important. And again, when you see these numbers come down and you say, wait, these are people that don't even been charged with anything. Just think about that for one moment. That is pretty extreme. And I'm really pleased that Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Ayanna Pressley have joined me in this effort. And this really came from grassroots organizations and others who have been hearing from loved ones. I know our office get calls all the time, all over the 13th district, talking about loved ones right now that have, diabetes, that, just, couldn't afford to move the process faster, or whatever the brokenness that we again experience. But it's heartbreaking to hear from a mother, a sister the other day calling me saying, please help. I don't want my brother to die incarcerated. He doesn't belong there.
Wow. So in the context of this moment, your bill is coming at a time when there's a number of recent bills on public safety sort of floating about. There's the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that was brought by Congressional Black Caucus Chair Karen Bass and Senator Cory Booker. So can you explain for us why your bill adds to the mix? What's so important about introducing it now in this moment, right after Democrat leadership proposed a justice reform bill? And where does your bill go that other bills do not?
I see it as separate. It isn't really addressing the same issues that we're trying to address with mass incarceration. And, we're moving around, leading with compassion when it comes to this particular issue. And again, I think the pandemic exposed just how broken a lot of our systems is, including our incarceration. I mean, to hear some of the horror stories, even from those that work in some of my corrections officers, like, hey, this is what's happening. And because there's this compassion, like, I don't want these folks to die. There's nowhere to quarantine them, Rashida. There's nowhere to really get them the aid, the care that they need. It's almost like they're waiting for them to not be able to breathe anymore, to all of a sudden take them to the hospital. I mean, it's just complete chaos, and it doesn't need to be that way. We can be much, much more compassionate, leading with around human services, around care, around working with community-based organizations and so forth. But as I'm continuing to hear from Movement for Black Lives and many of these coalition members that are really grassroots organizations on the ground that are not only working to stop the criminalization of our poor folks, but also to expose the militarization of our police and the over spending that we see on, handcuffs and supplies and all this stuff, where we have schools with no clean drinking water, right? And so a lot of the folks that we've been working with on this bill are really much more focused on those systematic, real problems, because as many of us want to focus on who killed George Floyd, which is very important, but that knee to his neck represented so much bigger than the who. It's what killed George Floyd. The fact that that officer was able to do it, right, with just no emotion. This almost like this, you can see even as he became unconscious, nothing, no reaction. And this is a person that probably continued to get away with that. But we have to equally think of not just who, which is, people focusing on police and so-called reforms there. We're not focusing on what, and that is equally, to me, and many of the advocates I hear from, is equally important. We really have to look at these structural racist issues. And, when I see children in my district in court right now begging for the right to read, they're begging for right to literacy. I mean, they're in court begging for something that is their right, that it should be hands-on. And these are young Black youth. And so when we talk about these issues, it's so much more than what's being offered in justice and policing. And just because my colleagues introduced does not mean that we can't continue to move with a much more aggressiveness around some of these other broken systems that I feel like cannot be ignored, because as folks want to deal with the who, they're not really dealing with the major really issue of what killed him.
And when you raise it that way, when you draw the comparison, I would much rather buy a hot lunch for every kid in America than more tear gas canisters. For what it's worth. So I want to move to Amanda Alexander. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
So mass incarceration has had an impact on public health long before the pandemic and far beyond the parameters of simply coronavirus. Can you talk with us about how mass incarceration has impacted the public health of Detroit residents, and then also how the pandemic has exacerbated those problems?
Sure. So I think that what the pandemic has laid bare is that we have spent decades investing in institutions that degrade Black life instead of exalting it. So what we have seen here in Detroit is that we are one of the unhealthiest cities in the US. We're one of the poorest cities in the US. We have people living in the city without running water. They've had their water shut off because they are too poor to pay. We have sky-high asthma rates. We have, people who are living without shelter. Again, these problems of people without adequate education, kids with mold in their schools and without clean water in their schools. And that is, the result of priorities and what we've invested in, what we haven't. So last year, out of the city's general fund, we spent $294 million on police and $9 million on health. And so, of course, we're going to get the types of outcomes that we get when we are deeply invested in policing and caging people rather than investing in public health. And what we're seeing now is that what we have created in our policing system, in our jails and our prisons are these petri dishes for COVID-19. We are hearing horrific things out of the Wayne County Jail, and that is why the Detroit Justice Center filed a federal lawsuit with our partners at Advancement Project and Civil Rights Corps to get people out. Just this week, nurses spoke out saying that they are incredibly short-staffed. It is impossible to care for people in the Wayne County Jail. There are shifts where they're supposed to have 10 to 13 nurses there to pass meds and care for people, and instead they'll have 2 or 3 nurses. People are, getting masks that you're supposed to use once, and they're lasting them for weeks. People are deeply unsafe. They don't have enough soap. And as we know, this makes people who are incarcerated unsafe, and that would be reason enough to release people and to create a safer situation. But it also makes all of us unsafe because, as you said, people are coming and going as they're staffing and things like this. So, I think that what has happened with the jails and the fact that COVID rates continue to climb there while they come down in the rest of Michigan is the result of the investments that we've made over time. It's an opportunity to shift that.
I wanted to dig into your sort of community network that you've built here, because you've been working on community-based justice partnerships for a really long time. And can you tell us a bit about how decriminalizing low-level offenses and incentivizing the release of low-risk populations impact the communities that you're working with more broadly?
Sure. So there was a study, a statewide study last year that showed that 50% of the criminal cases in Michigan system are traffic related. So these are people who are driving on a suspended license and getting picked up and jailed. Our jails are full of people who cannot afford a few $100s in bail. We have so criminalized poverty that our jails are full of poor Black folks, undocumented folks, and others. And so, what we have an opportunity to do right now is to shift this system entirely. In Wayne County, our jail population is usually about 1,600 people. Now it stands at about 800. And, to be absolutely clear, many more people need to be released. This is not a low enough number. And yet, what this should be telling us is that we should not be continuing to build a brand new jail that is slated to have 2,280 beds and a massive youth jail of 160 beds. So those are being constructed right now. And what this moment should tell us is that we need to halt that construction, halt those investments, and instead recognize that we should not be refilling these jails now that we've seen what's possible in terms of reducing the population. I also want to be really clear about, we cannot continue to separate out violent, nonviolent, high risk, low risk. Our population in Michigan, our prison population is so high because we have some of the longest sentences in the country. So the average minimum sentence in the state of Michigan is 10 years. And so we have people who are in for a very long time. And we also need to focus on releasing those folks. Governor Whitmer has the power to commute people's sentences and to release people who have been in for decades on very serious offenses, and yet she has not used that power once. She has not commuted a single sentence, even though people are crying out from behind the walls. Their loved ones are calling upon her to do something about this. So I just want to be absolutely clear that yes, we can do a lot of good by decriminalizing and by making sure that people are not going in on the front end and churning through our jails, but we also have to, reduce the prison population by focusing on those serious offenses and, long prison terms as well.
So speaking of calling upon elected officials, I'd like to turn to Nicholas Buckingham. Your organization, Michigan Liberation, has been working with formerly incarcerated people and their families to call on elected officials in Michigan to release vulnerable people from jails and prisons, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think also some of the points that have been made more broadly are important here too. So how has the pandemic impacted the communities and people you work with, and what have you heard back from the elected officials that you've spoken with?
Yeah, to answer that second question, nothing. But how has this impacted the communities that we are working with? A lot of our folks that we deal with are formerly incarcerated, and many of them have just come home within the last year or two. And, we do work with some folks that have been down for 20 and 30 years and have seen pandemics break out inside of the prison. And so it leaves this moment of one wanting to be eager to get into the fight, and just having this hope that we can turn, our governor and our prosecutor. But then there's this loss of hope when we're not getting any type of response. We started to organize around these issues back in February and even before February, but coming into COVID-19, we created petitions, we created letters, we did direct actions at the governor's office and also at the MDOC headquarters. And we were sharing personal testimonies from folks that were on the inside, people that were saying, I didn't come to prison to die. I wanted to serve my sentence and I want to come home to my children. We know people that we were really close to while we were incarcerated, myself, formerly incarcerated, spending over 7 years in prison. And to know that some of the people that I have, one, jailed with, but also went through a phase of rehabilitation with, have now contracted the virus. And now there's about 68 deaths within the prison system today. It's a scary thing. And when we think about the uprisings that just recently took place, our governor and our prosecutor, Kim Worthy, has went completely silent on what is happening inside of MDOC. The cases are still rising. We cannot separate people in those conditions when we have up to 8 to 10 people inside of one cell, and the death rate is still rising. And I think the governor really needs to take initiative to listen to the grassroots organizers. We gave her a plan. Even around truth and sentencing, we understand what it means to do a mass release, especially of violent offenders. Myself went in for armed robbery, so I understand how that looks to the community. But if we talk about legislation, especially around truth and sentencing, we can change these draconic laws and start to reduce the prison population in half before 2021.
So Nicholas, here we are, we're streaming live online. Presumably we have thousands of people watching us right now. What would you want to say directly to DA Kim Worthy or Governor Whitmer? If you could speak directly with them right now, what would you say?
You have a lot of blood in your hands. You have a lot of death on your hands. So when we talk about accountability, one, we did a power meeting with Kim Worthy, and the very first question we brought up was around our letter and our petition in regards to COVID-19 in the county jails and also in the prosecution. And the very first thing Kim Worthy said was she didn't get the letter. And we know for a fact that she did get the letter, but she didn't open it up to read it. And that lets the community know that you do not really care about the concerns that we really have, but you are willing to, continuously lock up Black and brown bodies and sentence them for long periods of time. This isn't something that's just coming from a formerly incarcerated population. This is coming from the jail staff. This is coming from folks that are inside the jail. This is coming from the community that her constituents have voted her in. And now that we're making these concerns and we're making these call outs, and to tell this community, I never received your letter, is a huge smack in the face. But for Governor Gretchen, our organization endorsed her. And we believed in her and putting her in a position of power. And now that we really need her to pay attention to what's happening in MDOC. And I want to say live, right now, that many of us, formerly incarcerated and non-formerly incarcerated, when we say we had the governor's back on this, we really had the governor's back. But to go completely silent on us is a huge smack in the face. And it sets this tone for many of us that come out and we claim to be returning citizens, but we want to get into the process of voting. And many of us are turning our backs on our legislators because the voting process is not working. If you're not going to listen to our voice, why put you in a position of power?
Thank you so much for that answer. I have a few questions that are for all of you as a group. And I think actually, Nicholas, some of your network may be best situated to talk about this particular question, but like very concretely for our viewers, we've said that we have to release people to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and reduce the number of overall deaths. But I'd love it if you, Nicholas, could talk very concretely about like why releases save lives. And then also Amanda and Representative Tlaib, if you could weigh in from a policy perspective on this idea of connecting lower populations to lower risk.
Yeah, sure. When we look at the prison population here in Michigan, it's about 90% of the folks that are incarcerated will be coming home to your community one day. Only a small portion of the folks are sentenced to life without parole within our prison system. Many of those folks had started their sentence as a juvenile, in which laws have changed around that to start to bring a lot of them home. But when we think about rehabilitation, and going through the prison system and what that should look like for the community versus, somebody that wants this rehabilitation but is afraid that they're going to lose their life because of COVID-19. We want to give folks a second opportunity. We want to get the community geared up and ready for a mass release. And there's a mass release that always happens. This is the thing that we're not telling the community. Here in Detroit, 5,000 to 7,000 people are returning home every single day. So when we talk about a mass release, not every single day, I'm sorry, every single year, we're getting that amount of people. So when we talk about a mass release of folks that's coming out, we have to keep in mind that we're seeing this mass release. It's just not publicized. We have so many people that are coming home from the jails and the prisons, and we understand like folks want to hold people accountable, but we don't want to hold them accountable and say, hey, you have to go to prison and fight against COVID-19. And if you lose that battle, then that's on you because you committed your crime. There's a lot of folks that are in prison because of nonviolence. It broke my heart when I seen people in jail for child support, and they were treated the same way I was treated when I was in there for armed robbery. And it's how do we separate, not the violent and nonviolent, but how do we separate this degree of how people are treated within our prisons and our jails? And now to say that your human life isn't worth anything because of whatever crime you committed. If you happen to get COVID-19, you have to do your best to fight against it. And that is wrong.
Let me add one other factor to the mix as I ask Amanda and Representative Tlaib to respond, because Nicholas, some of the stuff you just laid out is so compelling and so concrete and so human and important. There was a poll that came out from the Justice Collaborative Institute in collaboration with Data for Progress. And that polling indicated that 7 in 10 voters support elected officials taking measures that would reduce overcrowding in jails and prisons. And 6 in 10 support exactly what we're talking about, which is releasing vulnerable people, low-risk people from jails. So I'd love, when you talk to us about why release saves lives, for you to factor in, with polling like that out there, how could there be any kind of resistance against these ideas?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what it comes down to is that, again, these institutions are not meant to care for people. They are meant to degrade and punish people. And so they could suddenly, cannot be turned into, bastions of wonderful healthcare or things that protect public health. Instead, quite the opposite. It is impossible to socially distance in jails and prisons. The ventilation systems just, brew and spread COVID-19. People are not given adequate, sanitation materials, soap. They're just, disastrous for health and public health, period, much less with a raging pandemic. And so, all sorts of, experts have recommended that release is the only way to actually protect people inside and to stem the spread and to keep communities safe. I also want to say we have seen this flourishing of mutual aid, over the last several months of COVID. And we have, let the governor know that there are people out here who are willing to, create safe housing for people, to make sure that there is continuation in healthcare, in telehealth, in grocery delivery, whatever it takes to release people safely. Communities are rising. Like you said, there's this poll data. People are ready for this. They are beyond ready, especially people who are inside and their loved ones, but the community at large. And so, we are, ready to welcome our people home. And it's something that Governor Whitmer has to do. And the longer that she waits, again, the more blood that she has on her hands.
Representative Tlaib, can you weigh in on the national perspective on this question?
Yeah, I mean, for many of my neighbors and even some of my colleagues who are very much supportive of this, they see it as a humanitarian crisis. But even the data that, some of them are very data driven, is in, 2019, the Council on State Governments found that 45% of state prison admissions nationwide are due to violations of probation and parole, and technical violations alone account for about 25% of prison admissions. And most alarming, which I think is the one issue that I keep referencing to, is 99% of the growth in jail populations over the last 15 years as a result of pre-trial populations. So these are people who are legally innocent. But even when we talk about that and I try to categorize it, it is a death sentence to be in a system that is this broken, that doesn't have enough resources or soap or nurses, as Amanda talked about. We are pretty much, not only is it a dehumanization, but you really are saying you're disposable, that it's okay if you get COVID versus, others. These are our sons, our daughters, our loved ones that are incarcerated right now. And no matter, whatever, if it's what Nick did before or whatever it is, people get hung up on that. But one thing that I know people understand is no one deserves to die in these conditions. And that's what doing nothing will result in, is more death and more illnesses and sickness. And, a lot of people are not talking about this, but it's important to know more and more people, and studies are showing that even if you recover from COVID, you're having lasting medical impact from having COVID. Some people are still alive but not well. They are having, breathing issues, other issues. I even have a family member where, even the sense of smell hasn't come back for that person. I mean, there's just so much complications when it comes to this pandemic. And it's not like we get a pandemic ever so often. This is a very rare moment in our country. And again, just like I truly believe, from our homeless neighbors to those that are very, very much at risk, these are human beings that are in our care right now. And we don't have the capacity nor the resources to truly make sure they stay alive. And I just feel, again, it's a humanitarian crisis and we need to release them immediately.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank all of you for joining us here on the briefing to talk about this genuinely life or death situation that we're facing nationally. I'd also like to tell our viewers that we're going to be live again today at 2 o'clock, at 3 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock. You can't shake us, can't get rid of us. We're coming back. We have 2 forums coming up for critical New York races. And we're also going to be speaking with Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Justin Amash about their bill to end qualified immunity for police. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This has been The Briefing. Thanks so much.